People in the past behaved as best they knew how with the devices they had. They did not have any extrasensory devices. I'm not talking about telepathy. They're not having any extrasensory devices to anticipate anything with. Perhaps in the future, much of the activity will be in developing increased sensory devices, new types of external devices, meaning like the eye will operate both microscopically, and telescopically. The ear will be able to pick up a wider range of sound. Today, perhaps, some people might be capable of hearing 30,000 cycles per second. In the future, they can adjust. Tomorrow, the brain will be modified with additions added to it of living substance. I'm not talking about silica.
No. You're designing that now.
Yes. We're borderlining that now. This is the very early stages of that. Yeah. But we will have, these are not gigantic entities put into the brain. They're very tiny. And they maintain control of the tissue. They maintain the cartilaginous substance. They maintain all the elements of the body at their optimal performance. Right. You don't age. You maintain a particular level of physiology. However, if there are requirements that you want to go into the future that calls for changes in your physiology, that would be a decision you would make. So I see a future, not too distant from now, where human physiology is modified so that we no longer resemble the physical beings of the past. Just as nature surpassed existing plants that were dominant millions of years ago, all the animals that used to exist millions of years ago have been surpassed by changes. The same with human beings. That's accomplished by re-engineering the human structure. Today, the crude term is genetic engineering, but not necessarily as crude as that. We'll be able to affect the design of a human body, redesign it so that the heart, instead of being a pump, circulates blood constantly and smoothly through the body. There's no abruptions. A pump moves up and back, whereas a turbine is constant. So we speak in sentences because we run out of air. That's where you get that from. You say, hey, John, let me tell you something. You go on, you breathe. But if you had a constant flow in the body of oxygen, you would be able to, our language, instead of having abruptions in it, like I'm speaking, soup has abruptions. The language of the future will sound something like, no abruptions.
Why change?
Oh, because it's more efficient. It consumes much more energy to stop and then restate the compressed air in your lungs and arrange it into words.
Yeah, but there's no law. I mean, there's no lack of energy. It's not like we need more energy.
You would be surprised. With a high input of the future, you can't operate with the receptors that exist in you today. They are just insufficient to handle the onslaught of information. The human brain presently might be able to handle 7 different things at the same time, several. You can walk, think about things, drink coffee, but there's a certain load that we can't handle when it gets beyond a certain point. The human being, in order to keep up with changes to come, also has to be modified. Instead of having 5 senses or 6 senses, whatever people attach to human beings, they will have a multiplicity of senses, dependent on what they're investigating. Their sensory equipment will be internal, some of it external to their bodies. So when you look at machines, instead of looking at them as outside operating equipment, they're merely extensions of human attributes. If you look at machines that way, then although you don't see the connection, the physical connection, they're not plugged into the human body, although they are indirectly, intellectually and electronically. So machines become the extensions that we rely on. And the activities of people will be physical activities that tend to promote health and all that, will be games like tennis. However, you're playing yourself on the other end. So you don't compete against another person. You compete against yourself, and then you improve your ability to play tennis, or you improve prove your ability to swim. While you are swimming, you're being monitored. And you look toward the monitor, or you listen to the monitor, and the monitor says the reason you're putting out all that effort is because your fingers will separate. If you bring them together, you will get a better stroke in swimming. In other words, all that the equipment is designed to do is improve the performance of your physical attributes. And although they look like us in the future, in the distant future, they will look a lot like us, but their facial expressions will seem cold. It'll seem less expressive, because in the early days, you were an hour late. They had facial expressions of resentment for the time delay, the fact that they were waiting, so you see emotion expressed in the face. In the future, a person says, I'll be there at 8:15. They understand if conditions permit that. So there's very little anxiety. They will be able to handle situations and not emote at every change that occurs. They will be able to handle situations and maintain a fairly constant level of consciousness and well-being. Instead of depressed, aggravated, those conditions will tend to be diminished considerably. A lot of them would take in particular areas of investigation. They will design and engineer new kinds of fruit and new kinds of life forms. And they will look at them and study them and anticipate what life forms might be like beyond that and try to go. They'll go as far as they can go. They will develop devices to go on planetary expeditions, and they will devise auditoriums in which they will design these things, in which they can walk upon another planet without going there. They will be able to transfer their consciousness, I'm using old language, their consciousness anywhere, as though they were there. In other words, which is very different. Today you have to get in the car and go for a drive. And then when you're through, you say, I've been for a drive, I'm satisfied. In other words, you can do that in the future without actually going anywhere. This is into the distant future in which we'll have the ability, like we culture life in a petri dish, there will be big mechanical systems and electrical systems for culturing living tissue, so that you need not have farms or agriculture or hydroponics, but that would be into the distant future. When I use the term distant future, I mean whenever the process is developed, not necessarily 100 years from now. It could be 2 years or 3 years from now. As agriculture develops, say, moves into hydroponics, and as we advance in cell culture and nanotechnology, we probably will have new types of agricultural industries in which you may have large transparent tubes in which cell culture, in other words, instead of going an apple tree to get apples, we will culture apple tissue in glass tubes, and through artificial circulation or circulatory system, the apple tissue will multiply. It'll then be stored and cut up and delivered to the distribution centers. In other words, we will be able to grow whatever kind of food you want in vitro. You know, you needn't have farms. This is the distant future. Distant, I mean, possibly within 30 years. We'll be able to grow foods, skin, living tissue, brain tissue, kidneys, heart, liver. We'll be able to reproduce all those things instead of waiting for donors. And in the very distant future, they will design organisms, not themselves, they'll design organisms that crawl into the sea. And when they get to the water, they will change, morph into the ideal shape to move through the sea. When they come out of the sea, they will crawl on the land. When they come to a tree, they will morph to another form, the best form to climb that tree. So intellectually and physiologically, the people or humans in the distant future will have that capability of morphing. Anything a human being can imagine, I should say almost anything a human can imagine, can be built or accomplished in that time. Telecommunications at some point in the future. Let's assume we go 300 years into the future. Telecommunications might require a gadget, a thing, a wrist unit that you can talk to or see vision. In the future, an implant, a very tiny implant, perhaps no larger than a 16th of an inch in diameter, implanted in the body, which you don't need telephones anymore. You can keep posted if you want that information. So all kinds of gadgets around that are used to extend human awareness or consciousness will be ingredients implanted into the human. Now, I'm not talking about big gadgets installed in the human being. They are so tiny, and every year or so, they will get smaller and smaller and increase their capacity, I should say. So a world full of junk and apparatus, telephone, television, typewriters, and all that sort of thing will undergo change. So much so that if you took a person of the 20th century and moved them into the latter part of the 21st century, they wouldn't know what they were looking at. They wouldn't feel comfortable either. And though you can't take people that have been conditioned in an earlier civilization and move them into a system too far in advance because they can't identify with it. They would dislike it, actually. This represents a unit suspended from the ceiling with surgical instruments at the tip of the unit. The surgeon in a hospital sticks his hands in gloves and moves them a certain way, and this moves in the same way. So you can do surgery in Sweden. You get the best surgeon in Sweden to do surgery in America, or vice versa. A surgeon on land can work on a problem in outer space. If a man is injured or hurt, he grabs the surgical instruments, he has a three-dimensional image of the person in front of him and works on that person. He doesn't have to go out there. So you don't need emergency transportation.